It is 10 a.m. and we have a sizable amount of folks with us joining. There are about 41 of you all. We have a wonderful mixture of MTC and the public Bay Area community, so welcome. And thank you for joining us on this casual morning for a coffee conversation on climate change. So to everyone here, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. Again, this is a special conversation on the topic of climate change in the Bay Area. My name is Mark Anthony Sabaratan. I am a Coral Fellow with Plan Bay Area 2050, and I'll be your host this morning. We know that we're all living in really different times right now. COVID-19 has had an impact on all of us personally and professionally. And we want to thank you all for joining us and for continuing to help us rebuild a better Bay Area. Today, we are joined with Canyon Sayer Roods, the co-founder and CEO of Canyon Consulting, LLC, and our very own Rachel Hartofilis. Canyon Consulting is a consulting firm that strives to bridge the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems. And Rachel is a regional planner at MTC ABAG, whose work focuses on climate resilience. Today, all of you joining us will have a chance to listen in on this conversation and then converse with your fellow Bay Area neighbors. The first half hour of our event will be dedicated to the conversation between our special guests. And then during the latter half, we'll split you all up into small groups, and you'll have a chance to share out those ideas that we discussed in the first half and perhaps share your own perspectives on what the MTC ABAG community can do to help rebuild a better Bay Area. I'd also like to note that this event is part of our public engagement efforts for Plan Bay Area 2050. So welcome, and before we begin, I wanted to focus on some things here, our agreements and expectations for an effective meeting space. This is a virtual container, much different than how we usually do our meetings. But I wanted to welcome you all and give you all the rundown of how we will participate. So the first agreement is I want you all to ask yourself, how are we showing up for others and for this morning? I want us all to accept and expect a lack of closure, especially around this topic. I want us to respect each other, ourselves, and the clock, as we have a limited time together. And I want us all to be open to new ideas, as well as generating them too. This is a wonderful group of people who are dedicated to rebuilding their communities. I hope they can all share that. Expectations for you all, participants, you will remain on mute to avoid background noise unless you are speaking in the small groups. Please be mindful of your airtime. We will occasionally call on folks, so your facilitator will give you a chance to speak in the small group. Please consider this an invitation and not necessarily an obligation. And then please keep the chat reserved for questions to the speakers or to the staff. If you're having technical issues or if you have any questions about the content, feel free to use the chat section to get our attention there. And as a host and the speakers and facilitators, we will all make sure that you all have fair and equal airtime to participate and share what you wish to share. So now if we can have Canyon, our special guest this morning, to move us into a land acknowledgement. Normally we would be coming to you from the Bay Area Metro Center, which is in San Francisco City proper, but we wanted to acknowledge the land that we are on and have Canyon lead us through a land acknowledgement.
Thank you. Mishmin Tuhis, Connor Cotton, Human Sayers Roots. I would to acknowledge, first of all, I'm currently in Indian Canyon, the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. I am in Mutsun Ohlone territory. We use the term Ohlone to identify the original peoples of the Bay Area, spanning from San Francisco down to Monterey Bay. However, just so you know, Ohlone is a misnomer. And as an Indigenous person who identifies with that word, I always try to be sure that in the opportunity to share with the public that this is a unique parameter. So because we are in San Francisco proper, if we were in person, I usually ask everybody to repeat after I share this. So I invite you to say this word with me or after I hear, or just, can you say the word Yelamu? The village site before San Francisco was known as San Francisco, before it was California. Yelamu is the village site of the land. And Ramaytush, territory. There are over 8 languages in Ohlone territory. And north of us, north of the Golden Gate Bridge, is the Miwok. So acknowledging these 9 counties, these different territories, that there is a diverse amount of language, community, culture, and just we share these waters, and it's important that we honor truth and history in these territories. And my mother and my grandmother believe that when ceremony and dancing stops, so does the earth. I too believe that. So for a short grandmother's song, a song that came to me differently than it was taught, but is to honor our grandmothers, their grandmothers, and in all Mother Earth. For without them and with her, we would not be here. We share this time and space together, reason. So it's with that humility, gratitude, that present-mindedness that I offer this song here in this space. And at the end of this, you can say, oh, because when we all say that in unison, can send that song out in prayer and in good energy, and it's a little bit better than a clap. So I invite you to do so if you feel comfortable. So this is Canyon's grandmother's song. My oh Kawana, my oh Kawana, my no, my oh Kawana. My And welcome to these indigenous lands that we all can take time to honor truth and history, learn about these lands that you are on into colonial settled society. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Canyon, for that land acknowledgement. And as others noted in the chat that the audio is cutting in and off, we will have to work with what we have this morning and really try to make sure that we can dedicate this space as effectively as we can. So again, I want to welcome you all to this casual chat conversation on the topic of climate change. Again, my name is Mark Anthony. I'll be your host this morning. We are joined with Canyon Coyote woman Saya Roods. He's the co-founder and CEO of Canyon Consulting LLC, where she strives to bridge the gap between indigenous and contemporary value systems. Her goal is to make a difference in the lives of others by sharing her life experiences and knowledge about California Native Americans, focusing on global education with emphasis on promoting understanding of the relationship between humanity and the natural world. We are also joined this morning by Rachel Hartofilis, who is a resilience planner, focused on environmental risk across the Bay Area with a special interest in adapting to sea level rise. So we're going to begin our Q&A section here. I'm currently drinking Phil's coffee this morning, so I hope you all have something warm to get you all invigorated for this conversation. Go ahead and share in the chat what you're drinking, or raise your glass to a good morning of good conversation. Wonderful, thank you. This is great. Water is good too. Water is wonderful. All right, so I wanted to begin engaging our speakers here. If our speakers, Rachel and Canyon, would like to say hello before we begin, so that folks know who you are.
Hi, I'm Rachel Hartofilis. I'm a resilience planner with MTC. Nice to be here today.
Great.
Mishmi Tuhis, Canyon Coyote woman and Indigenous California cultural representative, educator, consultant, and all in all, attempting to be a good ancestor in training. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you both. And I wanted to kick off the conversation with acknowledging that we are already in the middle of climate change, really. It's happening all around us in the Bay Area with rising sea levels, as well as extreme weather events. And here in California, we're at close proximity to many of these events. In what ways do the both of you see the Bay Area adapting to climate change? I'd like to have Rachel begin the conversation and really talk about her work and what the Bay Area is doing. And then Canyon will jump in as well and provide a rounded out experience there.
Great. Well, thank you for the great introduction, y'all. So as I think all of us can speak to, I think we know that there's been a lot of work done in the region already in terms of climate change. For one, there's been a focus on sea level rise and inundation across the region. Our partners just recently at the Bay Conservation and Development Commission released a report, the Adapting to Rising Tides Bay Area report, which was a comprehensive analysis of the region's vulnerability to sea level rise. And there's also been a slew of other great resources on adaptation and sea level rise across the region. And we've even integrated it into Plan Bay Area 2050, which is our new long-range plan looking out towards the future. There's also some communities that have addressed their own flood mitigation through planning, taxes, and other measures, not just with sea level rise. And additionally, I think it's important to mention that the region has set an incredible precedent with Measure AA, which was a regional ballot measure in 2016 that funds the restoration of crucial like Bay Area wetlands for a slew of climate benefits. And that's something that is pretty groundbreaking and hasn't happened here before and hasn't really happened in most of the country. But additionally, we've, as a region, had a strong focus on fire awareness and management, especially with climate change really exacerbating our risks. There's many communities that have wildfire management in place already and are managing their forests and attempting to reduce fuel and come to more natural patterns. There's even legislation with, for instance, State Bill 1241, which requires that high-risk communities both acknowledge and plan for wildfire risk within the general plan. And even at the state level, again, despite big budget deficits, the state is still committed to advancing efforts to continue to adapt forests to our growing wildfire threats. I should also mention that we are really lucky to be in a state that prioritizes mitigation as well. So we're really looking at the whole picture of adaptation. And the state as a whole is taking significant strides towards GHG reduction. The Bay has been on the forefront of a lot of that work. Even recently with Berkeley, for instance, trying to replace natural gas with electricity. And then transit agencies are electrifying their fleets. And over the past few decades here in the Bay, we've really, reduced outward sprawl and focused a lot of our growth near transit systems, which has been an important land use pattern. So we have a history of, adaptation in the Bay and in the recent era. And I think also an important opportunity to continue to be a leader in this field. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Canyon.
Can I get the rephrase of that inquiry? My mind was like, oh, that sounds awesome. And I'm like, I apologize on that.
Yeah.
Is this about resilience?
Yeah, Rachel, thank you for that context for us. This is through the lens of a planner. And now we want, Canyon, your perspective. How do you see the Bay Area addressing climate resilience and climate change?
I feel very lucky to be alive today. As my mother would clarify, today is the best time that a California Indigenous person is the best day to be alive, given the history of the settler colonial narrative of the Americas. However, I am so very blessed to witness the efforts and endeavors of community that are taking steps to be conscious and aware of steps and strategies around this. I frequent many communities around permaculture, around conscious communities, around recognizing what cultural appropriation is, given that when we think about Indigenous peoples, we need to acknowledge that they have been tending and stewarding the land since time immemorial, and with little to no resources. Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the world and 2% of the United States, yet Indigenous peoples attempt to protect over 85% of the world's bioregional territories and biocultural territories. So here in the Bay, I feel really lucky given that in these 9 counties, there's funding and support for tribal advisory committee meetings where there's actual capacity given to Indigenous peoples to be a part of decision-making practices and processes and policies. It's slow. As an Indigenous person in the 21st century, I know I'm very lucky given recognizing what my mother has been through around protecting cultural resources, protecting sacred sites, honoring the water, honoring the biocultural diversity of Indigenous plants and medicines. And Indigenous peoples have not been able to tend or steward the land since contact. And when we think about acknowledging Ohlone Portola Trail, that's 250 years that the land has not had cultural burns. And now I'm seeing California Indigenous groups engage in fire management practices. So I feel so happy to witness this. I'm seeing biological, ecological restoration efforts, working with different agencies and communities. I'm seeing colleges bring Indigenous peoples as real consultants and bring them on staff, or at least on an ongoing basis, instead of just saying, hi, local native, do your song and dance routine so we could have an inclusive opportunity of culture of like just the song and dance or the arts and crafts. There's actual integral relationship building with the community and real efforts in honoring truth and history. So I feel very lucky. And I also remember that some areas aren't as comprehensive in this effort. Even in permaculture circles or agroecology circles, some places still don't include Indigenous peoples, and there are efforts that are commodified. But when we think about honoring native land and inclusive tactics, we need to include everybody, and that sometimes means becoming familiar with a lens that we're unfamiliar with. So I'm lucky to be in the Bay, and I'm happy to share space with people here. And I'll probably leave a few more comments for the secondary question. So, yeah.
Thank you, Canyon. And I think it's vital that we celebrate the good work that we are doing, but it's also vital to recognize that there is much yet to be done. And so this question now to you, Canyon, is we understand that there's a lot we could partner with and there's more that we can do to address climate change. How do you think governments, particularly a regional government like MTC, ABAG, or perhaps other MPOs, could be doing a better job? What collaborations do you think we need to create?
Well, I will offer a criticism, given that we need to recognize where the struggles are and the challenges are. So I'll do a parallel with many times when we consider the environmental impact of various projects, many organizations will have their project lead and managers and start deciding what needs to happen or what needs to be done. A new parking complex, a new building, a new something, a new road. And then they proceed in acknowledging the impact of the environment of both biological and cultural resources. And then later on, when they seek permits, they then realize they have to follow some policies and procedures. I'll use NAGPRA and CEQA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, CEQA, California Environmental Qualities Act. They then realize that they need to include Indigenous peoples, so they reach out with either a phone call or a letter, reaching out to the Native people saying, I've learned that you need to be informed about any development happening in what is considered your ancestral homelands. Do you have any concerns or any extra information that we could use for this project? And that is what the concept of legal consultation, the bare minimum of what they're doing. They're waiting to the very end of the process and then barely acknowledging that they have to include Indigenous peoples to recognize how they're impacting the land. I highly recommend that it starts earlier on. We recognize that there's a struggle or problem, then we reach out or continue a relationship with the Indigenous peoples of whose land we're on to find out an opportunity of what solution can be done. We have this problem, let's work together. What is the most reasonable way that we can go forward in solving this? Instead of waiting till the last minute saying, oh, are you okay with a building on ancestral remains over here? Or do you want to have a parking lot on the shell mound over here? You can't pick no to be an answer. You have to pick one or the other, A or B. Thank you, Native peoples. And so the criticism is the considerations of Indigenous peoples being brought on in the later half of the decision-making practice and policy is problematic. And so, and also the hard part is Indigenous peoples, our communities are small and we're limited. I'm always really busy, but I'm always trying to encourage public agencies, governing structures, businesses to include Indigenous peoples in their decision-making practices, because there's a lot of information that could be brought into the decision-making practice about sustainable futures and strategies toward that. And so I can't tell you exactly how to go about it, but I have to say we have to consider how are our actions and words impacting not only ourselves, not only our environment, not only all of our families, ecological systems, our kinship to nature, but 7 generations in the future. That sometimes means saying no to that quick turnaround, like quarter-end dividend, quick profit. And it means we might have to say no to some things because we need to have a longer-term investment in that decision. And many decisions that have been made here in the Americas, here in California, the way I call it is many decisions after contact have been very primitive. They've been very reactionary. They're very quick and they don't consider the impact, like the gold rush, blowing up mountains, polluting waters, damaging ecosystems, very primitive and reactionary. And so changing our strategies on how we make these decisions. And the same thing is if Native peoples aren't a part of the conversation, are the decisions that are being made really considerate or inclusive or just? So inclusion and steps towards honoring truth and history. We need to look at the history of these territories today and take steps to acknowledge that history so we can make informed decisions going forward. So, yeah.
This is a unique opportunity to recognize that we have in this group planners and people who are dedicated in the community to think about this moment in history with COVID-19 and our unique role and this is a time for us to rebuild and recreate a new beginning for the Bay Area. And so I want to give the same question to Rachel. How do you think the government or governments like MTC ABAG could be doing a better job? What collaborations do you think we need to be making?
That's a really good question. And I think, like as Kenya was saying, I think our collaboration with one another is critical. We need to be talking with one another and communicating. And this is really important with our neighbors of all kinds, if it's a jurisdiction, if it's a community. Because nature doesn't observe our boundaries, we have to work across them. And with climate adaptation specifically, we need to consult with one another to make sure that our plans or policies benefit one another and don't have adverse effects. I think with sea level rise, that's a great, a particularly good example of this, where if one community builds a seawall, it's going to have direct impacts on some nearby community, like in some cases even pushing water in that direction. So we can't operate in a silo. It's also just in communicating with one another, it's critical, as Kenya was saying, for sharing our knowledge and experiences. This has happened before to somebody. This is just natural processes and us dealing with them on a different scale. And the Bay Area in particular has a really rich knowledge and a rich history. Tapping into that community knowledge and that community passion is going to really help us advance better plans, stronger plans, and make us ultimately more resilient. Here at MTC ABAG, we've really been trying to increase how we hear from our communities, particularly those that are impacted most by environmental events. Additionally, another way in which we should be collaborating is looking at different kinds of stakeholders in the room as well. As many of us have seen with wildfires, the droughts in the last few years, our infrastructure systems get compromised quickly. And to be truly resilient, we need to have conversations with the stakeholders who manage those systems and make sure that they're also in the room. So I think a good example of this is San Francisco's Lifelines Council, where there's stakeholders who are focused on communication, on power, fuel, water, wastewater, transportation, and they're in the room with city agencies, community partners discussing emergency planning and adaptation. So climate resiliency and working towards adaptation is absolutely dependent on us working together. Here at our agency, we continue to advance how we can engage more broadly and more deeply. And so we're striving even now to be learning in this current pandemic and trying to be more adaptive with how we can connect with people. For instance, bridging this digital divide. But yeah, it's absolutely critical that we continue to work together and talk to one another.
Thank you, Rachel. This question is for you, bouncing off again. And I wanted to know, what are we learning in consultation with our Native communities and our other communities that are here sharing the space? What are we learning in the resiliency process and the planning process moving forward?
Sorry, repeat that one more time. My sound went out.
Oh, sure. Yeah. What are we learning here as a resilience planner moving forward with Plan Bay Area, perhaps with the future of climate change adaptations, in consultation with our Native communities and other communities who are here affected and sharing the space? What are you learning, and how are you moving forward with that knowledge?
That's a great question. I think that we're continuing to learn how we can best communicate with one another, how we can get people in the room, and how we can effectively engage people in the process early and keep their voices in the room. We don't want to just check in once and go into more planning, but we want to continue to have a relationship with our communities. And here in the Bay, we have 9 counties and many different communities. So I think that's something that we're continuing to learn how to do. And having relationships with Native communities is going to be really important for us moving forward. And it's nice too, we just introduced the environment section into our long range plan. And I think this is a really good opportunity for us to engage with different stakeholders and to see what that can look like and how we can utilize the knowledge that's already within the Bay to make our plan ultimately more resilient, and to look forward into our implementation plan and see what opportunities our communities see for us.
Canyon, I'm curious, as a consultant, you mentioned that starting earlier and getting the perspective of Native communities early on is vital to planning. I wanted to know what, in your experience, is a success story of this consultation and in bringing in the voices into the planning process.
Well, not that I'm trying to put all the eggs in one basket, given that this is new. I am witnessing an organization like Ecosystem Restoration Camps, that is known internationally, come to California and take strategic steps in encouraging activating local community members to take steps to approaching their skill set with permaculture, apply their permaculture skill set to ecosystem restoration camps towards the effort of ecosystem restoration. And the council that is for California is taking strategic steps to have a cultural competency circle to learn about the history of California and the land before they just go off gallivanting and just engaging with applying their skills, saying, oh, we learned these cool things, let's go do this, and let's talk about carbon sequestration and put swales in and do this restoration of the land, when possibly some people may or may not know about the truth of history in California and in these territories, and how the settler colonial mentality of entitlement and engaging with assumption and presumption and those efforts, they're taking steps to be appropriate, building bridges and being accountable. Some of us, we ourselves in community, we're not the perpetrators of the negative effects of colonization. However, we benefit from some of those decisions and practices, and we need to recognize what is an equitable approach. Hearing from people who are not in the room, acknowledging that there are many disenfranchised, marginalized community members that are present that have not had their voices heard, and they're deeply impacted by some of the decisions we make. Who's not in the room, and how can we build bridges to engage community, to recognize that we can have equitable solutions with each other if we take time to collaborate and listen to each other intentionally, instead of just saying, oh, we had a meeting and we had a listening session, ta-da, let's go on as business as usual. Sometimes it means all of the practices and procedures and protocols may be shifted from learning from these, and that's what it's really going to take. And so in that, I'm seeing beautiful circles arise from this. And I feel lucky to be in the Bay Area because I'm able to say that I work in, I'm very passionate about what I do in this world as an activist and as an educator. As a consultant, I am lucky to engage with community who are taking steps to be conscious. I also recognize that I do need to get into more difficult conversations with organizations that don't really know how they might be contributing to the problematic occurrences, especially here in the Bay Area. And I'm strengthening my approach when it comes to engaging those community members, but I feel very lucky to have community members reach out and say, what does this look like? So that's one little example, is ecosystem restoration camps. However, collaborations with colleges, coming into territories and bringing in indigenous teachings that aren't engaging in cultural appropriation, but appreciation and methods of honoring truth and history, bringing in storytelling, bringing in medicinal and ecological and botanical restoration practices, and just considerations to how we are related to the earth, and recognizing the rights of nature and taking into consideration the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, bringing that into our curriculum, bringing that into our procedures, and having commissions and organizations say, we're going to follow these guidelines. So I feel lucky.
Thank you, Canyon. I recognize that we have some wonderful questions coming in the chat, but this is a perfect time to acknowledge we are now going to break out into our small groups. And Canyon and Rachel will be floating around into each small group to perhaps try to answer some of those questions that we have had in the chat. And so I wanted to give us a rundown of what the small group is going to be. You'll be placed with a facilitator from MTC ABAG. They will help lead some introductions with the group. Feel free to be open and share as much as you're willing to share. And really think about what we talked about this morning. This will be followed by a share out at the very end, and some closure for all of us. All right, folks, so welcome back from that intimate conversation. It was far more intimate than we anticipated. So we appreciate you sharing with your facilitator and with our MTC ABAG staff. We apologize, we had quite a few folks leave during that transition period. So this is now being a much smaller group. But now that we come back together with our final 10 minutes, I want us to reflect and close on this conversation. In the very beginning, I mentioned that this wouldn't be a comprehensive conversation, but perhaps the beginning of something good here. And so I wanted us to go to our facilitators, just a select few, to talk about what you had discussed and answer some of the questions that we considered. Starting with Leah, do you want to give us a recap of what you discussed in your small group?
Sure. Well, we had a small group of 4, including myself. And when we talked about what stood out, and folks were really interested in CEQA and what kind of reform limits does there's a lot of discussion about CEQA and will the reforms that are supposed to occur limit engagement as we go forward. We also brought up what's missing. What has gone well in the Bay Area? We've talked about some of the negative things, but what has gone well? There are many things out there that we could do in addition that add, there are fees for dumping. Perhaps we should be charging for gas-powered vehicles. And then we talked about righting the wrongs, making sure that what we do solves some of the problems that we've created. And that's what my group saw from our first question. We did go on to discuss some other things, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Leah. Next, we want to go to Catalina. Do you want to share what your group discussed?
Yes, hello. So we also had a small group. We had 2 participants, plus myself and Rachel. And some of the things that came up is just a acknowledgement that it is easy to have a short-term view of things, especially when working in transportation. And we need to be careful to not try to fix one problem and just basically push it down the road. You creates another problem someplace else. So just the importance of being cognizant of those sorts of things. We did have an interesting idea of the importance of potentially building some relationships with car dealerships and maybe enhancing programs to provide vehicles for low-income individuals, vehicles that are less polluting, potentially even electric vehicles. But even with electric vehicles, we have some individuals who have such long commutes in the Bay Area that they may not be able to complete their trip with their charge. But anyway, to think about programs like that. And that was a few other things, but that was the highlights.
Thanks, Catalina. And lastly, Michael, you want to give us a rundown of what you discussed?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, we had a small group as well. So I'll also draw on some of the remarks from Canyon at the beginning. We did talk a little bit about engagement, particularly as something that MTC and ABAG can continue to really be improving and focusing on, particularly in this kind of climate adaptation, climate change space. I really appreciated Canyon's remarks. She said something really eloquently in the response to the first question. I'm looking forward to going back and watching the recording to get the language right. But it was something to the effect of needing to include everybody, which sometimes means listening to a perspective that's unknown or from someone you don't know. And then in our chat, there was also the discussion that was developing before it ended that like true civic engagement is really hard and it takes time. And oftentimes the benefits of building those relationships maybe aren't really known until you're getting to implementation way down the line. And so just I think a request for ABAG and MTC to really see the value in building these relationships, not just for, getting through the plan cycle, but then setting up for a more robust, plan that is getting implemented out there with the community.
Thanks, Michael. I wanted to give the last word to Canyon here. We are in this space sharing with planners and community members. I wanted to know, what are we taking away, or what can we take away as planners and stewards of our land and communities from this conversation today?
I would encourage people to be advantageous of learning ways that we can honor truth and history, given that when we are in a position of making decisions that we're going to impact more than ourselves, we need to come to the table prepared. And if we do not know about the history of the land that we are on, if we do not know about the systemic injustices that have occurred to many people, many circles, many communities, and if we don't have inclusive procedures and considerations of what true inclusion means, because sometimes inviting someone and recognizing they may not be comfortable joining because there's a lack of trust, we have to consider, what does it really mean to be in community together? And how could we all be good ancestors in training, think about your legacy or the legacy of a space or a group or an organization. Does that legacy prioritize profit? Does that legacy prioritize what it wants in the now? Or will it be an ongoing procedure of considering how our actions and words will impact 7 generations in the future? And so honoring truth and history, honor the past to shape the future, and recognize that we are all growing, we are all healing, and we could be good ancestors in training.